I'm joined today by Makenzie Arvidson, and Makenzie was a guest that I wanted to have on the show because of your wealth of knowledge in the field of psychology, which I've noticed our group, the three of us, Patrick, Austin, and myself, have been talking a lot about. We're actually reading a book called 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. And so there'll be times where we're having discussions and then we'll come to, try to understand what he's talking about, but we realize we're limited in our understanding. So I wanted to thank you for coming on and maybe helping us understand a little bit better some of these ideas.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Well, getting right into it, I guess if you wanted to let our listeners, all two people, know maybe what motivated you to get into psychology. Was it something from a young age or while you were in school? Like, what kind of motivated you to pursue that?
Yeah. I think it's kind of silly or maybe stereotypical maybe, but I was originally in school for nursing, and you have to take like a Psych 101 course.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know what it was, but there's something while I was like sitting in my lecture hall, and there was hundreds of students in this like gen ed class, and there was something I was like, I am so fascinated by this, and that had never happened to me in my life. So I've always had pretty streamlined interests my whole life, which music.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of hard, but I also love academics. I love learning. I want to be a learner for the rest of my life. And so, yeah, there was something that clicked, and I remember I told my parents I was switching my major to psychology, and they were so mad. They were like, what job are you going to get? So, yeah, I think that's where it happened. There was something about wanting to know how our brains work and why people do what they do. So,
yeah. No, it's definitely interesting as far as being a freshman in college and then having to tell your parents, oh, I'm changing my major already. And I can see that being a tough sell, but obviously it's panned out well for you and your parents, I guess, as well.
Yeah.
But there are very few things in life where you're doing that thing or you're learning about something to where you just want to learn more. You've had that hunger. And I think it's interesting too you bring up music, because for the listener at home, we've played music together for quite a few years, all throughout high school. Definitely something we're both very passionate about. But I think there comes a point where you realize, okay, this can't, or maybe it won't be a job, or
right.
You just kind of understand, like, everyone's trying to do this, maybe we try to do something else. But it's good that you're able to find something that you love to do. And I majored in accounting in school, and definitely was something where it's okay, I'm just going to do this. Wasn't ever very passionate about it, but c'est la vie.
Right.
So I'm trying to work through all that
right.
Currently. But did you take a psychology class in high school at all, or was it college was your first one?
College was my first one. I could not have cared any less about psychology, or really didn't even know. I mean, I knew what it was, I guess, but no, I did not care. I mean, like, I'm thinking of when I was a kid and you're asked, like, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Right.
The only thing I ever said was, I want to be a singer. That was it.
Yeah.
So it was like, I had no concept of it. My first experience was in college. Although I do know Mr. Holtis had a psychology class in high school.
Shout out Mr. Holtis wherever you are
Jesse.
in the world. Yeah, Jesse. So then you're in college, you're majoring in psychology, you love it, you graduate, kind of fast forwarding through the timeline here a little bit, but so maybe it's senior year, you're looking for jobs. Do you have an idea of maybe, okay, I'm interested in learning in this. Do you have an idea of, okay, what's the next step? Where am I going after school?
Yeah, so for my major, you had to have an internship.
Okay.
And so my uncle works at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. So I did my internship over the summer at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. They have a behavioral facility. It's essentially a bunch of inpatient units with children ranging from, I think I even saw like 2-3 years old, up to 21. And so I interned there. And so when my senior year of college, they had asked me, we'd love for when you graduate to come work. So I
That's
pretty
a
much,
good feeling.
yeah, it is. It is, especially with my parents who are like, you'll never find a job. So
Right.
yeah, it was very, very good, but very challenging working at Children's.
So you do the internship. You love it. That's quite an age range too of people to be working with, 2 to 21. You said. So was there a particular age group that you got along with better, or was it just, were the issues similar like throughout that spectrum of ages?
That's a really good question. They're not similar. I mean, similar in the sense that all of the children are there for basically one reason. They've experienced some type of crisis, and that is what brought them to the inpatient unit. But the differences between the younger kids and the older kids was pretty stark, just because so when I worked there, not during my internship. During my internship, I worked with all ages. But when I worked there, I primarily worked with adolescents. So that was 11 to 18, sometimes up to 21. But the little kids, a lot of times they're there for behavioral issues. So you'll see a lot of like reactive attachment where they have kind of these like crazy outbursts, their struggle to handle their anger and any of emotions. Whereas with the older kids, you see a lot of depression, anxiety, things like that. So closer to those kind of more tougher issues like suicide.
Yeah, and I'm wondering too if some of those, like the childhood traumas of learning to deal with those emotions when they're spiking, you know, like that's a very important skill to be a part of society. And I could be off here, or maybe you're like, there isn't a connection here, but is there a connection between maybe like not learning to control those issues at a younger age and then them manifesting into something like suicide or even something like anxiety? Or because I know even in our lifetime, like anxiety has just become such a big talking point, or something that I think almost everybody relates to in some way, either themselves personally or someone they know. So is there some kind of correlation between those things, or do you think of them as like separate kind of issues?
No, I absolutely think there's correlations. I do want to preface and say I am not an expert by any means, but my master's is in basically crisis and trauma. So that's kind of what I've focused on. A lot of my schooling was trauma. And you're exactly right that a lot of these kids, due to their circumstances, and not always their circumstances, it doesn't always have to be like this really rough situation growing up. Sometimes they have a normal life, or what we would guess is a normal life, or what we would associate as normal. But yeah, exactly. So we do a lot, or when I worked there, we did a lot of coping strategy, skill building, which is exactly what you just said. So learning how to respond to our emotions that can otherwise feel really overwhelming. And if you kind of have these learned responses to your anger, to your sadness, that may seem over the top or not a normal response. That's how you are. Like that's what you know, and that's how you've learned to get attention, how you've learned to get support, anything like that. So yeah, I think that the coping skills is exactly, once they've learned those, they're better able to face those challenges like anger, sadness, anxiety. But I think also this is a thing you hear a lot in psychology, is this idea of like, oh, there are more kids with autism now. There are more kids with depression and anxiety. And I think on one hand, there is more identification of kids with those disorders or struggles. But on the other hand, I think it's just become more known. Like even my parents, they didn't validate a lot of stuff about psychology and mental health. It took a lot for them to learn that these are real issues that people have and struggle with.
I know. It's interesting to think about the generational differences. And like I think you were saying, there's almost been a lot of discovery or identifying, like you were saying, of these issues, whereas, maybe for older generations they existed, but they're difficult to see, or you need experts to study. I think it was funny you made the aside too, or this is a quick aside, I'm sorry, that I'm going to make, that you made the distinction that you're not an expert, because we do that almost every podcast we do as well. Just like we'll get very into something and be like, wait, I don't know what I'm talking about. But right. You definitely do know what you're talking about. I want to validate you in that, or affirm you, I guess, that you do know what you're talking about. But but going back to these like mental, it's not a disease, but just infirmities, I guess, that like we all deal with or think about. And I'm not sure if I ever told you, but when I was younger, I had similar issues where difficult regulating anger, difficulties with overwhelming anxiety. Was actually on medication for a while when I was younger, but then learned the coping, like through probably some of the programs that you would do, like learned ways to cope with that, and was fine. But like I'm definitely someone that very much benefited from those things, and so I definitely agree that it's important to at least acknowledge that those things exist, and that it's definitely worth studying or researching, right. And not just turning the blind eye to. Absolutely. Or denying to. I don't think many people are that way anymore, but even as like a kid trying to understand what's you're going through or dealing with, it doesn't help when people are like, oh, it's all in your head. And like to an extent it is, but to have people that will listen to you and talk with you through it is super helpful.
Well, and I think when you look at it as not being something wrong with someone else,
right.
Instead, it's just like if you think of a person and a capable person someone you would deem capable, they have this set of skills or these tools. I do this activity with the kids I've worked with, like at schools and at the hospital. I do this activity called creating your toolbox. And inside it, I have like, I'll make like a wrench and a hammer. But inside of it, it's like identify people that you trust, adults that you trust, or what are coping skills? How could I tell by looking at you that you're starting to feel angry or upset? All these different things, so that they can accumulate their toolbox, so that they can use their tools later when they have a challenge. But like you take that almost for granted for a lot of people who were raised in maybe a more supportive home or were taught those skills, that they just have them. They're able to control their anger and they're able to respond to their emotions. But sometimes that's just not the case. Sometimes children develop and they don't develop those skills, and adults too, and in turn it can affect your adulthood. But it's all about teaching those tools so that they can be more successful.
That's really cool. Because I think about like a speech class that you would take. They do those sort of things where you're visualizing like a room and then you're placing certain things in certain areas. Right. It almost reminds me of that kind of like illustration, but because we're very visual beings, and so being able to understand a toolbox is something we've all seen and can understand, and assigning meaning to these different tools and understanding when to use them or when they're flaring up. That's super cool that you're able to do that. I wanted to run something by you that I remember from when I was a kid, like in counseling, and it was very simple, but they said like wear a rubber band, and whenever you're having an anxious thought, think about it like a TV, and like the rubber band's a remote, and you're like changing the channel when you just like snap it against your skin like gently or something. That really worked for me for whatever reason. Is that something you've ever heard of, or can you see like, oh yeah, there's some merit to that, or something
absolutely.
Like that?
I've definitely heard of the rubber band snapping, but it's this bigger idea. Probably what I imagine you were doing was called CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy.
Okay.
And it's basically this idea of like changing our mindset. So for people who struggle with anxious thoughts, it can be overwhelming when your thoughts are kind of taking over. It's all you can think about. So CBT has this idea that you can take a hold of those and then change those behavior or those thoughts. So kind of with that idea of like you're literally flipping the remote on your thoughts and saying, that's not what I'm going to be focusing on right now. So yeah, absolutely.
That's cool. It reminds me too. So in the book we're reading that I alluded to earlier, there's this reference to T.S. Eliot, the poet, but apparently he wrote a play, and in the play, the person's talking with a psychologist and asks, is this thing in my life a result of my own doing, or is it a result of nature, God, etc.? and the psychologist is kind of taken aback by the question and like asks, well, what's the difference? Like, you have the problem you're trying to work through. And the character essentially says, well, if it's my own fault, it's something I can control and fix. But if it's nature, something that God has set in motion, it's something out of my control. So that's it. That quote reminds me of that, because it is like, in that moment, it can feel like, oh, I can't sort through all this. It's too much information going on in my mind. But then if you can do something simple, easy, manageable to kind of set that chaos into order, just focus on the one thought, then the next thought, then, like, that's something that's very practical and very, manageable for a person.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
I think that also kind of, I don't know if this is where you want to go, but
sure, we can go anywhere.
I just think of that idea of psychology, like, or when I was going through school and kind of getting acquainted with what psychology is, there's almost this dissonance between psychology and Christianity, and kind of navigating through that, because when you look at psychology and theories, a lot of that doesn't leave room for God. I mean, to me it does. Like, now in hindsight and looking at it, like, I think practicing psychology or any type of psychology with children or adults or anything, like, it is my greatest way to, like, engage with God and his people. But there is this, like, dissonance between there, because it's like, in Christianity, especially if you're raised that way, it's like God is in control, which is absolutely true. But I'm saying, like, he wouldn't give you, he gives his toughest battles to his strongest soldiers, and, like, he'll never bring you through anything you can't get through, and doesn't leave room for these areas like anxiety, where someone who's a devout Christ follower and who loves worshiping and honoring God and still struggles with something like anxiety, which it says in the Bible that he doesn't give you a spirit of anxiety. So how do you wrestle with that? How do you validate?
It's a great question.
Right.
Yeah. And, well, I'll start by saying I don't have an answer maybe, but I think that those are kind of questions that are worth asking, because there is, I think, in my limited experience or knowledge, there is kind of a branch of the Christian faith that doesn't embrace sort of those mental issues because of, like, verses like that you can quote, maybe even out of context. I don't know the context of the verses. I'll be the first to say that, but, it seems to me at first, thought that you're basically taking something you're hearing at face value and not thinking about you're taking the verse and using it to support a limited understanding, maybe.
Yeah.
But I guess and part of what my mind goes to when you ask that question is sanctification and how mystical that process is, as far as it's like the come as you are, don't leave as you come. Like, I don't know, that's just one of those catchy things that millions of people say that comes to mind. But it's like, maybe you don't have anxiety at first, but then you do, and then it's like life in a lot of ways is suffering. So it's like, this is the burden that you have to bear. And I think there are cases too where, like, you can be healed of those things through prayer, through counseling, through, taking the proper steps to address the issue. But at the same time, a lot of people, my mom comes to mind as someone where, it's almost like a perpetual issue you're learning to deal with, you're learning to cope with. And so it's definitely, I don't think it's a simple issue of, just grin and bear it, get through it, or, and it's frustrating. I can imagine it's frustrating for someone going through that, because they know that they should be in control of it, but they're not. So that, like, there's like some sort of dissonance even within themselves of, I should know how to manage these thoughts, but I can't, or I'm not. And
absolutely.
That, I can imagine that sparking the anxiety on further, instead of something that's being more closer to, like, a remedy for it. So,
and the way I've always looked at it is, when a person is sick, like has cancer or any type of medical issue, and let's say, you know, they're brought to the altar and they're prayed over, and then that disease doesn't go away.
Yeah.
That does not mean God isn't capable to do those things. He says he is. And it also doesn't mean the person with the sickness is that there's something blotted on them that God couldn't fix it because they have a problem. I mean, it is literally the same, but there is some type of stigma around mental health. Whereas just because, I mean, your mom is a perfect example. Like, such a woman of faith. I hope she doesn't mind us talking about her. She might be like, be quiet. But at the same time, for anyone, like if you're struggling with something and it is a lifelong battle or whatever,
right.
like just because that doesn't go away doesn't mean that, one, you're less worthy of God's love, or that there's something wrong with you that God won't fix it. It's just, it is what it is. And I think it's such a nuanced thing where it's so stigmatized for Christ followers to have mental health issues, because that is a sign that you don't love God enough,
right.
that you haven't done something enough, which is in the very essence the complete opposite of what Christianity is as a whole, what we believe the gospel is. We were never worthy for anything. Yeah. So why would he start checking if we're worthy now? But anyway, I just think that it's something that as a Christ follower and practicer of psychology, I guess, it was something I really wanted to wrestle with and get to the bottom of, because I wanted to align those so clearly, you know. And I think it's really important. I'm passionate about it. I want to validate people, but also, you know, say that just because you struggle doesn't mean, you know, whatever. There's my PSA.
Can I ask you a difficult follow-up question?
Yeah.
Do you think you've been able to align the two as of now, or do you think that's something that's going to be a lifelong kind of like for you, like a goal to kind of like keep them aligned, or maybe it changes over time or as your understanding grows?
I think there'll always be something that I learn, or that I, like theories, for example, which is basically what all psychology is a bunch of theories.
Like music too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so kind of just always guiding through those and seeing where I align. But there was something that happened, I think when I was working at Children's, that just clicked for me. And because I always struggle, I think so many people do, struggle believing that what you're doing in your career, your life, which can seem so monotonous or so whatever.
Especially as an accountant.
Right? To see, like, is this God's purpose for me? Like, that was, I always struggled. I'm like, this can't be it. Like, he has to have me be a missionary and do X, Y, Z. But that's not the case. And kind of believing and hearing and being in kind of unity with God and knowing that he has put me exactly where I need to be has helped me. But also understanding that God is the creator of all things, including our minds, which, as we know, in any area, are vast. Like our minds that's a whole psychology, is the study of the mind.
Yeah.
But God created our minds. And so I don't believe anything he created is bad. And I don't think knowledge is bad. I think putting one above another, like putting my desire to be knowledgeable over my, you know, adoration towards God, that would be wrong. But I think that he wants us to know, and he gave us an ability to learn. Does that answer your question? I don't know.
No, it really does. And to be fair, I don't think there was quite an answer. It's more or less like, are you ever going to get to the spot where they're completely merged? But it's like you were saying, it's kind of like changing, especially as you're learning more theories over time. But I think what you're saying too interests me, in that, you know, just the complexity of the mind and how little we know about it. As far as like, even from a biological standpoint, it's like we know how the brain works to a certain extent. Again, not an expert, but I think we have an understanding of maybe like what the areas of the brain do, and we can do these complicated brain surgeries with relative ease. My cousin was actually a good example of this. Scott, you know, they were able to target a portion of his brain where seizures were happening, remove it, issues gone. Like, that's amazing. That's like a miracle to me. That's amazing that we can know how to do that. But the mind feels more like an ocean where we've explored like this much of it. Or even consciousness, I think, is a very interesting topic to try to discuss. You know, but it's one of those things where you wonder, I mean, obviously our knowledge is going to grow in these areas, but you wonder if there is something just spiritual or otherworldly about the mind that like can't fully be explained through scientific method and what we're able to know. So that's, yeah, I don't know. I agree with you in that at times it feels as if people want to try to distinguish, this is science, this is maybe psychology, which is a part of science, but then religion is something else. And like spirituality and religion, have some touch points, but they're different things too.
Right.
But these, I don't know, in my mind, I almost see them all as kind of like interworking in some kind of coherent, mystical way that, encumbers the world, or embodies the world, not encumbers. I don't even know if encumbers a word, but... So, sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there. I wanted to go back to the experience at Children's Hospital based on the discussion we've kind of just had, kind of this, understanding or trying to understand psychology, the way we're made. Were there any stories there where you're able to see like notable progression in like patients as far as like well-being or general mindsets, or even like crazy stories where something went terribly awry but then it was able to maybe work out, or maybe it didn't? I'm just curious to hear maybe some of that.
I think there was, it's so hard reflecting back on that time, because it was probably one of the hardest times of my life working there, because it was, you were walking into a battle zone every day.
Yeah.
And for, my shift was 8.5 hours. For those 8.5 hours, it was like I had to be on my toes every minute of it, because again, I'm working with adolescents in the height of their crisis. So they're there for quote unquote 5 to 7 days, could be longer. And it's kind of like what is called in trauma, like in trauma circles, like first aid, like emotional first aid. So we're kind of triaging them emotionally to get them to be able to go back out, because they've endured a crisis, which could be like a severe loss, like maybe extreme grief, or psychotic break, or suicide attempt, or anything of those nature. So anyway, it's a challenging time, and it's hard to look back and be like, oh, I remember a lot of these kids, they walked away so much better, because a lot of times it was just getting them good enough and give them their tools so that they can face their life out there. But I do remember when I was in an internship, there was, and I'll be vague, but there was a patient that had endured so much trauma, and this patient was young, and so much trauma in their lifetime that it had literally physically made them mute. Like it wasn't a choice, like they lost their ability to form words to speak because of how much trauma they had gone through, relentless trauma. And so when they got there, he was there for weeks and weeks, kind of learning how to speak again. So that was really cool to be like alongside that child through their journey, and like learning to communicate, which is just something we take so much for granted.
Yes.
And learning to express their emotions and things like that. So that was a really excellent story. But I have about 1 million scary or like crazy stories too that go on it. But yeah, it was just a lot of, we were trained in, it's called crisis intervention basically, but even to the point where we would have to like physically hold them if they were being aggressive, things like that. And that was what it was every day. There was somebody so mad, throwing things, breaking things, fighting you, or hurting themselves, and you're just kind of there as their support. And you have to leave your human emotions at the door almost. You can have your compassion and empathy, but you can't react. Like if you as a person were like started hitting me, I'd be like, Logan, you need to get off me. Or like, I would react. But that can't be done there. It's all like no emotion, no expression, no reaction, just like undying support. We'll be here to help you when you're ready. Like things like that. So
I'm sorry, I want to cut in here with a little bit that reminded me of the book we're reading or discussing, because the author is a clinical psychologist. So he had a practice, and he was talking about, essentially kids that are violent in that way, like especially with the hitting, or even some kids can be verbally violent as well. But if those behaviors aren't worked out properly, they pay the societal consequences later in life, because those aren't good behaviors to have in us. They're not productive. They're not, you can't handle arguments that way. And so he essentially framed it as, you can either parent your children like when you're seeing the issues, or if you're, this obviously doesn't apply specifically to those situations you're talking about. He's talking more generally, like not kids with like trauma backgrounds, but just in general. So it's a little bit different. Do want to preface that, but he was saying if you're not doing your job or as a parent, then those issues. So, because say you want to be compassionate to the kid without also like disciplining when there are like negative or like behaviors that would limit them from future opportunities, say, in the world. Because if you're not doing the parenting with the children, then the world essentially does that.
Yep.
And it's a lot more cruel at handing
harsh,
out.
yeah.
Yeah. And again, that's different from, obviously these kids have traumatic backgrounds, so it's like that's a whole other issue, but it just reminded me of what you were talking about with these kind of like general clinical patients he was seeing. And he has a good quote too of something how like the toddler is the most violent person in the world, as far as just like the outbursts and the hitting and the not sharing, the stealing, things like that. So it's a bit comical, but it's also true that if those behaviors aren't being noticed and like dealt with accordingly, then if they're left to persist, the child ends up paying consequences later as a result, and they learn their lessons with a lot more difficulty than they would with just the gentle rebuke of the parent.
Well, and that's really fascinating. Trauma aside, like
if
you look at children and their family dynamics, I mean, you see that there's this, I mean, they call it the poverty to prison pipeline, but let's look at poverty as like a general sense, which could be low income, but also diverse family structures. So we're so used to in our suburban life, which maybe you had some experience in, whatever. I'm just saying we can generalize and be like 2 parents, siblings, we went to private school. But that's just not the case for many, probably more than not. And even divorce all the way to being in foster care, you're hinging on this idea of like your parents teach you those lessons as you grow up, and almost you form this resiliency, this idea of like people believe that children are inherently resilient, that they like when they fall down and scrape their knee, get right back up, they'll be fine, that resiliency. But that is just not true. Like we are taught resiliency through our life.
Interesting.
Yeah, through supportive parents or whatever. So when you look at any type of child who goes through a different circumstance where that resiliency is not built, that's when we see things like if it's never managed, they can end up in prison for not being able to control their anger or, worse than that. So there are definitely these ties to like, if you don't have that support, it can ultimately really hinder you in your adulthood.
It's interesting you bring up the resiliency being a learned behavior or taught. Because sorry, I keep defaulting back to this book, but it's what's gotten me really interested into psychology is that he talks about, there's a philosopher, Rousseau, and that person essentially had the idea that children are inherently good or pure in spirit. They're definitely pure because they're young, they're inexperienced, but that if they were left essentially unattended, if they were just left to their own devices, they would grow up into these wonderful people, these wonderful creatures. But then he makes that point of, well, that's not the case because of the toddler being, this essentially aggressive person, and if those behaviors aren't worked out, it's interesting how much of who we become is what we're taught, and I know there's that old conversation of, genetics and then,
nature
like,
versus nurture.
Yeah, exactly, like all that sort of thing. So I guess I don't necessarily have enough knowledge to even form an opinion on that sort of stuff, but that's at least stuff I'm like starting to wrestle through or think about. And I was curious if you maybe had any thoughts of like the nature versus nurture stuff, or even with your experience, like, working with a lot of different kids with a lot of different backgrounds, if you had seen situations that maybe would have formed an opinion on that.
Yeah, I do somehow remember who Rousseau is. I took one philosophy class. I hated it. I hate philosophy,
Really?
which is so funny because it kind of, some people think they go against each other, psych and philosophy, but anyway. I think anybody, we were just talking about this the other day in one of my classes, nature versus nurture, and I think overall, if you look at anybody in psychology, they're going to say there can't be one without the other. Like there isn't just one solo. Like it isn't just how you're born, it isn't just how you're raised. Because if you think about it, at least for me, when I think of my mom, there's so many things that she has, and my dad, that are just inherent inside of me that I know I didn't learn. Like I can, it's just because I'm their child. But on the other hand, I think there are so many things that I learned because of circumstance. So I think they are, like, my confident answer is that you can't have one without the other.
I wonder about, so to maybe bring up a specific example, something like optimism versus pessimism. Is that something that you think would be a learned, because there's almost part of me that I'm a very optimistic person. And I just wonder if that's like innate in me, like that's God-given, if that's learned from like you said, it's probably both, but I don't know. And even just like the introverted, extroverted stuff is interesting to me too, because are you an introvert?
I am now, but I didn't used to be. I used to be an extrovert. So I think it fluctuates.
Was that through like COVID and everything?
No, it was like in college for some reason, or after I graduated college. I just don't know what it was.
Flip.
Yeah.
I think, I've definitely been, I always try to stay, I try to be a very balanced person, 9 on the Enneagram. So,
yeah,
so,
I know.
Yes, but like even with the introvert, extrovert stuff, I think depending on certain phases of my life, I've definitely felt more extroverted or more introverted. It's interesting to think like, where are you getting your energy from, and why does that change over time? And I don't know, like maybe that's a bit of the learned experience kind of shaping that dynamic within you. But then some people you meet and they're just, like, I work in accounting, so I can say this confidently. There are a ton of introverts like that love being accountants, could not talk to anyone all day and are fine like that. They would prefer that way. And I think I'm more maybe like an introvert with extroverted tendencies. So I like to be on my own, to have these like reveries where I'm like dreaming, thinking, creating. But then I ultimately need to share what I'm processing with people. So it's an interesting dance, but our makeup in our minds is just so intricate and like fascinating to think about, like how we got to these places where we are, and
Right.
The formative experiences, but then also the like what in us is just innate.
I think a good example of that, and again, I am no expert, so I'm just going off my personal experience. But
maybe that's a podcast we form. I'm no expert.
That's what my podcast was called, Not an Expert.
Not an expert. You already got, already ahead of the curve there. Yeah.
But my husband is like innately, he kind of reminds me of you a lot. He's innately optimistic, and he's such a dreamer. And he reminds
I want to
me
get him on the podcast.
Yeah, you should.
Yeah.
He reminds me of Luke too. I always said they were similar, but like such a dreamer. There's nothing too big for him, which is the complete opposite of me. Like I am a complete realist. I'm very logical, analytical.
My wife is that way.
Right.
As well. Yeah.
So kind of this dichotomy, I guess, between us two, because when I look at my family, I think inherently from my dad, we are the same, like the same way. But then on the same hand, I look at my husband, who his dad's a chemistry professor, so he's very, reasonable and scientific too. But they were always so encouraging. Like, there was nothing Carl could do his whole life that he couldn't do. Like, they wanted him to do anything, take every opportunity. He was raised in Africa. Like, he was just, like, all over.
I didn't know that.
Born and raised in Sudan. But, yeah, so he's just kind of always lived this really crazy life, whereas I've always lived kind of a structured, like, you're going to go to college, you're going to, make a living and have a house and blah, blah, blah.
I think it's interesting, too, because I think that's very much a Midwestern mindset of,
absolutely.
You're going to work hard, you're going to get your degree, then you're going to work hard some more, get married, have a family, all that. And, it's just maybe ingrained in us or taught or whatever, but that's funny to hear about. I didn't know Carl was from Africa, but that's really cool that has to be such a different experience.
For sure.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, as far as being just driven to dream, or because I'm the same, or I shouldn't say same, but I'm similar in that way where I have all these ideas, but I actualize very little to none of them, and my wife helps me kind of value them. So what's the most important? Let's do that thing, and then the other ones, maybe they fall to the wayside. If you have time, you address them. Whatever else. But
that was when Carl and I were dating. He had dropped out of college. He loves coffee. He's, like, done a couple coffee shops, blah, blah, blah. Like, he's just everywhere all at once. And it's so great to be around him. Like, he's so magnetic, But at the same time, when we're getting more serious, I'm like, I don't care that you dream. You can have any dream you want. Just pick one. Like, just do one. Just achieve a goal. Because that's... Dreaming is perfectly fine, and I'll support you in anything, but I also think you need fulfillment, whatever. So, and it's so cool to see, like, how we've kept going, and, like, he did some school for web design anyway, but he achieved a goal, and, like, how satisfying it's been for him. So, but it is very, very interesting to examine it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, too, you had mentioned earlier in the podcast, and then I think you had just alluded to your schooling. So you're at Miami Oxford, thank you. Studying, what exactly is the major?
School psychology. So I'll be a school psychologist at the end of it.
Cool.
Yep, and so it's a little bit different. It is psychology, but it has more to do with like special education and students with disabilities. So, like, I'll be at a public school and kind of do, like, assessments, diagnostic stuff, just to help make sure students with disabilities have the appropriate services. But yeah, that's what I'm doing.
Well, that's very exciting. And then you also have a podcast, Not an Expert.
Yeah.
And is this still something ongoing, or maybe it's paused, or?
I don't know. I will say I got the email. There's so much stuff to do for a podcast. But, like, you have to, like, have something. Like, I put it on a website, and then that puts it on Spotify or whatever.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And they asked me if I wanted to renew it, and I didn't. But maybe one day. I'll go back to it. But yes,
for the listener at home, or the viewer too, since this is being recorded, look at all the cameras. Feel free to check out Makenzie's podcast, Not an Expert. And Makenzie, I want to thank you so much for coming on. It was a really good conversation, I think, about some issues that I'm starting to gain interest in, but then you clearly are very wise in.
Thank you. I had such a good time.
Good. Glad to hear it. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Well, that was fun.